We want to hear someone who makes sense.
Okay. Right, it's very good to be here this morning. I thought that because I come from Wales, which is such a different country than here in the US, I thought you might find it interesting if I said something of the history there, and talking about my father, because there are links with Prince Charles. But Wales is a small country, 3 million population, to the west of England. So I'm not English, I'm actually Welsh. Welsh is a different language entirely. England, basically, the British Isles, the Anglo-Saxons invaded from Germany, a Germanic people, and they pushed into all the flat land in Britain. And so that became Angleland, which is what England is, Angleland, the land of the Angles. But they pushed the Celtic people out into the west and the north, Scotland, Wales and Ireland. Now, Wales is really hilly, mountainous, so it's very difficult for invaders. The Romans invaded, but they couldn't really take over Wales. Much later, the English invaded Wales, but they had a really hard time for hundreds of years, again because of the mountains. And the Welsh really didn't want an English king. In the end, the English king said, look, I'll give you my son. Before he becomes king after me, he can be your prince. So that's how we have the Prince of Wales. So Charles became Prince of Wales before he became King of England and Great Britain, although he wouldn't be Welsh. Now, Welsh is very different. The English language is a mixture of the Germanic Angles and Saxons and the Latin, the Latin languages from Rome. So English is a mixture of the sort of guttural, Ich bin ein Berliner, guttural German, and also the poetic sort of French and Spanish, more poetic languages. That's English. Welsh is entirely different, and I thought I might get you to pronounce some of the Welsh place names that I grew up with. I'll give you a tip. Listening to myself, you realize some of the sounds you have to take the tip of your tongue, bend it backwards, and touch the top of your mouth with the underneath of your tongue. So you make a sound, that's a sound. So I'll give you 3 place names and see if you could say them. I grew up near a place called Llanelli. You want to try Llanelli? Llanelli. Pretty good. Another one would be called Pwllheli. Try Pwllheli? Pwllheli. I'll just give you an easy one. Would be Llanfair Pwllgwyngyll o Gerwyn Drobel Llantysilio Gogogo. Actually, for a long time, it was the longest place name in the world. It was actually created by an Englishman in a Welsh village to bring tourists there. But now the longest place name is in New Zealand. Welsh surnames, last names. Jones is a classic Welsh name. Griffiths, Williams, Llywelyn, all of those are Welsh names. Famous Welsh people, Hannibal Lecter. Actually, Anthony Hopkins is the actor. Anthony Hopkins, Tom Jones, Richard Burton, Catherine Zeta-Jones, every one of those grew up about 20 miles from where I was born in the south of Wales. And they reckon that Merlin, with Arthur and the Round Table, Merlin the whatever he was would have been Welsh. Now, Wales is so different. It's the Welsh valleys. They're basically these canyons would be here in California. Very, very difficult, to get to. Very difficult terrain. But they discovered coal, and Wales became the centre of coal production for the Industrial Revolution of the world. So Wales is famous for its coal. It's also famous, it's called the land of song, for the singing. Now, my father was born up a Welsh valley. My grandfather was a Welsh miner. I've gone to what would be a terraced house, where you basically, each house, the side walls are the side walls of the next house. Very small terraced houses on the sides of canyons or the Welsh valleys, so for the coal miners to live in when they go to work down the mines. I've been in my grandfather's house where he'd been sitting in a tin bath, hot water washing the coal dust off. Now then, my father grew up. His mother died when he was like 7 years of age, and for a time he had to live with relatives. But eventually my grandfather had a young girl come into the house, so my father and his sister could come back to live in the house. And actually that young girl and my grandfather eventually married, and that became my grandmother. My grandmother, not blood related, but I always knew her as my grandmother. My father went down the mines, and as everybody did there. But when I think he was about 18 or 19, one morning he got on the bus that would take him to the mine. He saw one of his friends there. They were down the mine about 1.5 miles underground, and there was an explosion and an accident, and the friend was crippled and injured. So my father had to put him on his back, and he carried him 1.5 miles underground and out. By the time he got to the surface, the guy on his back was dead. And I know my father said that he sat down above ground, and I can't repeat what he said because it's not good language, but it was the equivalent of, forget this. And he gave up. He wasn't going to be a miner. So he joined the British Army. He did end up in Germany just after the Second World War. And he was in the British Army rugby team and the polo team, etc. Now he's a Welshman in England, and the English, they're puzzled with the Welsh. They don't know quite what to make of them, and they're not quite sure if they're human either. But my father found an attractive English lady with red hair living in Brighton and London, and eventually persuaded her to marry him. They came back to Wales, where I was born, and then my father joined the police. He left the army, joined the police. He was always liked swimming, and I remember, so he would train people to swim. He'd teach anybody to swim. I remember he then had a job in the police force teaching the police cadets to swim. Now, if they couldn't swim at the end of their training, they couldn't become policemen. And I would go along with him sometimes to the swimming pool. He'd be training the police cadets. I'd go swimming. And I've seen him take a wire brush, and he'd have the cadets that hadn't yet swum up on top of the diving board, and he'd have a wire brush, and they had to jump. They get rubbed with a wire brush into the water and swim. I mean, that's how he did things. They decided to have lifeguards on the coast in Wales, and somebody set up a lifeguard club in a seaside town called Porthcawl. So they asked my father to train the lifeguards, which he did, and I remember he really impressed all these, what in one sense would be beach bum type guys who wanted to be lifeguards. He trained them very thoroughly, very strictly. He's British Army, and as a result, they started to win a lot of lifeguard competitions. Lifeguarding grew up on the Welsh coast there. Now, I can remember one joke that my father found most I've ever seen him laugh, which was a British comedian called Les Dawson, who used to tell mother-in-law jokes. And this one particular joke, my father, I remember him laughing and laughing. It was, and you might get this, the guy said, "I bought my mother-in-law a chair for Christmas, but she won't plug it in." There you go. Now, at some point, my mother came to me and she said, "Look, Paul," she said, "a number of people are being honoured. The Queen has what's called the birthday honours list and the New Year's honours list, where there would be honours, where somebody would be made like Sir Richard Branson, or they'd be knighted or made Dame this or that, and there were various different honours." And she said, "Your father should be honoured for the work that he's done with the lifeguarding on the coast, but somebody has to gather all the evidence and send it to the British Home Office in London, and then they'll think about it." So she asked me, would I do that? So I had to sort of secretly go around and interview all the various different people. And for example, lots of those, what I called beach bums, were now, because my father had trained them, they were now managing leisure centres and swimming pools and sort of sometimes high up in, in those sort of posts. And a lot of people had a lot of very good things to say about my father and the work he'd done. Because with lifeguarding on the coast, good lifeguarding means there isn't any news. Nobody drowned. So I put all this evidence together privately, and we send it to the Home Office. And then my father was in the Queen's Birthday Honours list. It came out that he was going to be made a member of the British Empire. So he could write his name. Now his name was John Elwyn Anderson. The Elwyn was a Welsh name. John Elwyn Anderson. He could write John Elwyn Anderson, MBE, member of the British Empire. And, that was in the newspapers. We had to go to Cardiff Castle, the foundations of which were actually Roman stones, because the Romans built it. We went to Cardiff Castle. Prince Charles came down from, London to present my father. And I know that my father, he went out and Prince Charles was giving him the award. And my father was able to say to him, because my father in the British Army was in the Welsh Guards. You see these big black sort of things on their head, red uniforms. And he was able to say to Prince Charles that, I was on duty in Buckingham Palace the night you were born. So, he was there when Prince Charles was born on duty, and then Prince Charles gives him this MBE. I know my father used to say, because there were awards, as you say, Sir or Dame, MBE, OBE, and MBE, pardon?
What is the MBE?
MBE, my father, it's member of the British Empire, but my father said, he said, MBE, the difference between MBE and OBE, with an MBE, it's my bloody effort, and with an OBE, it's other people's bloody effort. So that's how he used to class it. Now, my father ended up then in his early 50s. He developed Parkinson's disease, and for 25 years plus, he had Parkinson's. My mother and he had a very, dynamic relationship. And my father got to the point where, in order to walk, he'd have to trip himself up, that's how it goes with Parkinson's. And my mother would be there. Now, she would call him Elwyn. The English friends would call him John. His sort of police friends would call him Andy. He had different names. So my mother called him Elwyn. And he'd be there, and then she'd be saying, Elwyn, walk properly. It's like, Mummy's got Parkinson's disease, I remember one night then my mother phones me up at like 2 a.m, and she says, Paul, your father's fallen over. Come and help. So, okay, I go along, but I called an ambulance because I thought, I'm not medical, so we arrive, and when we get there, my mother's really unhappy. She didn't want an ambulance come in. She wanted me just to sort out my dad. I said, yeah, I'll come, Mum, but we're going to get an ambulance in. I'm not medical. Another time she phones up and she says, Paul, he's fallen. And I said, okay, I'm coming, but I phoned an ambulance. When I get there, the ambulance had arrived and she told them, no, go away. She sent them away. She was like, I'm taking care of your father. So I'm there trying to help. The next minute, middle of the night, knock on the door, it's the police. Because if you call an ambulance, equivalent of 911 here, 999 in Britain, and then you send the ambulance away, well, the police come and investigate. So the police arrive at the door, and my mother's there, oh, hello, officer, but and my father's retired policeman, but they had to come and investigate. In the end, my mother had to give in, and my father had to go into a care home. I do remember years later, the lady in charge of the care home, on the reception saying, look, she said, there's nobody has cared more for their, partner. Your mother comes every day. My mother, in Britain, there's a lot of public transport. My mother was 6 miles away from the care home. She would need 2 buses to get there. She would go day after day, and the reception said, nobody has been more faithful than your mother. I remember then another time, 2 a.m, I get a phone call. Basically, could I go over to the care home? My father had died. I go there. It's the strangest of things. You know, my father is laid out on the bed there. There was a policeman in the room, and I'm sitting with the policeman, and he asked, did I want that he'd go out the room so I could just be alone? I didn't need that. But what a strange thing, you know, the man that gave birth to you, seeing him lying there on the bed. It was so very an unusual thing. They then had his funeral. They had, army people march in, and a lot of things. Now, the last thing was that I had to keep this very simple. When I was a teenager, there's a song. I don't know if you know it. He ain't heavy. He's my brother. Now, every time I'd hear that song, I would cry. As a teenager, I could think, what on earth why am I crying? Why does this song make me cry? I told my sister, and she said, well, didn't you know you had a brother? And I said, no. And she said, yeah, when you were 4, she was 4 years younger than me. So before she was born, when I was 2, a brother had been born. He'd actually been born and lived a few days. I didn't know that consciously, but obviously something had stuck. So eventually I ended up talking to my parents about it. And I discovered that he'd been... somebody said, look, if he was born, he was buried. He must be buried somewhere. So I asked my parents, and it turned out there's something called the Old House, which was a thatched roof pub up the Llinvi Valley, where we would go as a family for meals very often. Now this was 800 years old originally, and parts of it were actually built in the 12th century. Actually, people could point to a field and say, over in that field, the Romans massacred some of the locals. So that would have been 2,000 years before. This is sort of just memories, folk memories, really. Anyway, near this, the old house in Llangunnoedd is the village. There was a cemetery, and apparently I find out that my brother's buried in this cemetery. So I go, and eventually there was an unmarked plot, completely unmarked. And I asked my dad about it, and he said, well, actually his mother, who died when he was 8, was buried 6 foot down in this plot. And he said he'd gone a couple of times to try and tidy it up, but it rained, and he said he stood under some trees, and he thought, oh, well, Mum, you don't want me to do this. And so it was an unmarked plot. I found it, and apparently his mother was 6 foot down. My brother was 4 foot down. And what they discovered was that you could actually have somebody 2 foot down. My father was then going around various relatives asking if they wanted to, have the 2 foot down slot, but he didn't actually get any takers there. But after he died, we had his ashes, and my mother, my sister, and I went to by then I'd had a Celtic cross made, and I'd sort of had the grave tidied up, and we illegally sprinkled his ashes. You're not supposed to sprinkle ashes around like that, but we sprinkled them on that grave when nobody was watching. Last story, when he was awarded the MBE by the Queen, I wrote to the Reader's Digest, and I earned myself probably equivalent of about $500, because just a very short story, just a paragraph, but if you send off stories to Life's Like That or Humor in Uniform or whatever, Reader's Digest will pay you. And I sent a story. It basically said, when my father was awarded the MBE by the Queen for contributions to society, the next door neighbour put a note and a card through the door saying, congratulations on being awarded the MBE. Was it for mowing my lawn? So there you go. There's pictures of a different world than here in California. So a pleasure to speak to you.